Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the final conference of the 12th International Congress of Abralim. Thank you for being with us now. Today, we have the pleasure and the honor to listen to Dr. Brian Nosek, professor at the University of Virginia, Charlottesville, United States of America, and co-founder and executive director of the Center for Open Science, also at Charlottesville. I am Pedro Ricardo Bin, an undergraduate student in the English program at the Federal University of Santa Catarina, Florianópolis, Brazil. I am a member of the Language and Cognitive Processes Laboratory, LabLing, coordinated by Professor Maílson Borges Mota. And I'm also part of the Ambassadors Program of the Center for Open Science. I'm honored to be here today representing LabLing, and I would like to thank Abralim for the opportunity of moderating this conference. During this international congress, we learned about both the challenges and the possibilities of linguistics in open science. Abralim's initiative places the Brazilian linguistics community at the forefront in the international academic scenario. This key talk will provide fruitful insights on how we can, as a community, seek for structural changes in the system of scientific knowledge production and dissemination. This is why we are honored to listen to Professor Brian Nosek today. Professor Nosek studies the gap between values and practices, the difference between what is intended, what is supposed to happen, and what actually happens. Most of his research has applied this interest to implicit social cognition, that is, thoughts and feelings that occur outside of conscious awareness or control. His interest in the gap between values and practices is also applied to public science. Along with his academic contributions on the investigation of scientific practices, there is the idealization of the Center for Open Science, COS, a nonprofit organization that aims to increase openness, integrity, and reproducibility of research. The COS advocates for change in the culture and incentives that drive researchers' behavior, in the infrastructure that supports their research, and in the business models that dominate scholarly communication. Among a series of initiatives, the COS fosters connection between communities and open science enthusiasts in its Ambassadors Program, which I proudly take part of. In 2015, Professor Brian Nosek was named one of the Nature's 10 and was included in the Chronicle for Higher Education Influence list for his contributions on developing more transparent scientific practices. Today's talk will enrich our debate on how improving openness, rigor, and reproducibility in research is less a technical challenge and more a social challenge. This is why a culture change is urgent if you want to accelerate scientific progress and reclaim research credibility. As Professor Nosek presents, you can post your questions and comments in the chat, and he'll be happy to address them after the talk. So, Professor, thank you very much for accepting the invitation to be with us today. It is a great honor to welcome you.
Thank you, Pedro, for that very nice introduction, and I'm delighted to be here to speak with all of you today. As Pedro indicated, my scholarly interest is in the gap between values and practices, what we think we should do, what we're trying to do, what we want to do in our everyday behavior, versus what we actually do. And the Center for Open Science is a practical application of that research interest, trying to understand the gap between scientific values and scientific practices and how we might change the system of science so that the values that we have, the ideals that we aspire to for science, are actually realized, valued, and rewarded in everyday practice. So the presentation that I'd like to give today is a an overview of the approach that we have through the Center for Open Science about how we are trying to promote change in the system of science to align values and practices. So I will be delighted for any feedback that you have on how these issues and approaches resonate, apply to the things that you do in your work every day, or where you see parts missing or misaligned with how you see the challenges playing out in your area of research. So when we talk about the gap between values and practices, we should start with some articulation, or what are the values of science? And there are many ways to characterize them, but the one that I like to start with most often is Robert Merton's description of the norms of science. Robert Merton was a sociologist of science and generated these in the 1940s and 50s to try to describe how science operates as a community is distinct from other ways of learning and knowing things about the world. So his first norm was communality, the open sharing of information. When I make a scientific claim, you don't just trust it because I said so. You gain trust or credibility in that claim by me showing you the methodology that I used, the data that I generated, and the process of drawing an inference from that data to give the conclusion. Versus the counter norm of secrecy. No, I did all this work, I found this, trust me, just trust me, that's what I found. Merton's second norm is universalism. Research gains credibility based on its own merit, the quality of the research itself, versus the counter norm of particularism. We should believe this claim because famous person X said so. That is not how science is supposed to operate. Merton's third norm is disinterestedness. Researchers are motivated by knowledge and discovery, just trying to figure out how it all works, versus the counter norm of self-interestedness. My goal is to get ahead of all of the other people around me, is get the jobs, get the grant funding, get the rewards that others are, and we're competing against each other to advance our own careers rather than science. And then Merton's fourth norm is organized skepticism. A researcher considers all new evidence, even against their prior work, to gain a better understanding of how the world actually works, versus organized dogmatism. I create some initial findings and then spend my career fighting others to save my results and my interpretations against their competing interpretations. And while Merton didn't talk about it, a fifth norm that is a common one in discussion is the norm of quality of research over the counter norm of quantity of research. Now, you might look at this list of norms and recognize that these are commonly raised things about what characterizes scholarly research or science in particular. But an obvious question is, do researchers themselves endorse those norms of how science operates? Are those their shared values, or do they actually value the counter norms over the norms? And so Anderson and her colleagues did a survey. They asked about 3,300 researchers. Early career in this case is postdoctoral, people in postdoctoral positions. Mid-career are those who had just earned their first large grant in the US from the NIH, so average age of 40 or slightly over. And what you're seeing on this figure is the cumulative responses of their answers of, do you value the norm or the counter norm in how you think science should operate? And the gray bar is showing 90% of the sample, either early or mid-career, says that they value the norms over the counter norms on average. In black is the very small percentage of people who say, I actually think science should operate by the counter norms over the norms on average. And in the gray hatch lines are those that say, I weight both of these equally. Yeah, I think those norms are important, but I also think the counter norms are important for science. So near universal endorsement of the norms over the counter norms. So then Anderson and her colleagues said, okay, thank you for that. That's great. Now tell me, how do you behave? Don't tell me your values. Tell me your behaviors. Do you behave according to the norms of science, or do you behave according to the counter norms? And this is what they observe. Still, most people say that they behave according to the norms over the counter norms. And still very, very few people say they behave according to the counter norms over the norms. But now there's some more substantial portion that are saying, yeah, both of these have some influence on my everyday behavior. So then they said, okay, that's fine. Don't tell me how you behave. Tell me how all the others in your research community, how do they behave? And it looks like this. So what we observe here is at the top, almost everyone says that they believe in, they value the norms of science over the counter norms. In the middle, people mostly say that they behave according to the norms or values of science. And at the bottom, they say that the culture around them behaves according to the counter norms over the norms. Now, this is remarkable because it's the same people, right? The culture is comprised of the people who are answering the survey saying that they believe in these norms and values of science. And yet they perceive the culture as being misaligned with those values, of in fact valuing the opposite of what they think should be the way that science operates. So that suggests that this is a systemic problem. It isn't that everyone around me has different values than I do. And so maybe I don't belong because I just have different values than other scientists do. Scientists, by and large, share values, but all collectively exist in a system that doesn't support and reward those values. And that is an operational definition of a dysfunctional culture. And so the main goal that we have at the Center for Open Science is to align the values at the top with how the culture rewards and operationalizes those values at the bottom. And if we can get all of these bars to line up where people say, these are my values, I live by them, and my culture lives by them, then we will have, we presume, a much more functional culture and be able to make progress on the important questions we investigate every day. Okay, so what are the problems? What are the challenges? Where are the gaps in those values and practices? There are many things that we could talk about and many topics in the category of open science. For us, the core challenge is ultimately this, that the incentives for my individual success in research are focused on me getting my research published, not on me getting it right. I got into research not to publish things. Who gets into research because they say, I want to write lots of papers and write grant proposals? No one, right? Researchers get into research because they are curious. They want to solve problems. They have a particular approach to trying to figure things out and love the process of discovery. Right? There's lots of motivations that we have, but we also exist in a system with very specific reward structures. And one of the key rewards is publication. It's the currency of advancement in scholarly research. The more that I publish and the more prestigious the outlets that I publish in, the more likely I am to succeed and advance in my career. But as we know, not everything gets published. Some things are more publishable than others. I'm more likely to get published if I have a novel result, rather than trying to repeat and increase confidence in a prior result that somebody else had published. I'm more likely to get published with a positive result, right? I'm showing a relationship between these variables or showing an impact of this intervention, rather than a negative result. Nope, these aren't related. This didn't work. And I'm more likely to get published if I have a neat and tidy story where all my evidence fits together and supports a very broad general conclusion about the world. So a positive, novel, tidy story is the best kind of story in research because it's amazing when we accomplish that. Like finding something new and having a full, complete explanation that's supported by evidence for that new thing is incredible. But it's incredible in the sense that it doesn't happen very often, right? In our everyday research, progress is slow. Insights are hard. Things don't fit together. We have lots of false starts. And all of that is ordinary and normal and part of research because we're studying things we don't understand. That's why we study them. And so if the reward system is all about something that doesn't happen very often and doesn't reward the everyday process of what can be very rigorous but slow research, then we will create a system where I have a conflict of interest because I have discretion in how I do my research, how I report my research, and I have an interest in the outcome. So I might make choices, even without me realizing that I'm making them, that favor my self-interest in career advancement over the quality and advancement of the research that comes out of my group. So we can articulate that challenge with this kind of graph. So at the top are those incentives for novel, positive, tidy results. And there are a variety of things that happen in everyday practice as a consequence of those incentives. On the left, I might run many experiments in my lab and only report a subset because some of them don't work. They have negative results. They don't feel like they'd be as publishable. They don't fit with the story of my other findings. And so I leave them out. But that selective reporting then biases the reality of the area of research that I'm investigating. I might deploy questionable research practices, right? I could analyze the data multiple ways. Some of those ways look better for publication than other ways that I analyze the data. I might inadvertently rationalize to myself that the ways that look better are in fact the right ways to analyze and report that data, but simultaneously lower the credibility of the research without the reader being able to tell. Because the rewards are focused on the results, I'm not directly rewarded for being transparent, for showing you my process, for showing you my data, for making it clear what studies weren't included, all of those things that would help you as a reader evaluate the credibility of my findings. There just isn't any reason. In fact, there's reasons against me showing you all of that, given that primary incentive. And then finally, one of the key ways that we gain understanding of the credibility of a finding, its repeatability, is to conduct a replication. You saw it that one way, maybe I'll try it again in my context to see if I get it the same way, or if it's different than in your context versus mine, or maybe not repeatable at all. But if we're focused on novelty, then why would I bother running a replication of your research? Why would I bother replicating my own research? Because if I have a finding, the only thing that a replication can do is cause me to lose that finding and therefore lose the rewards that I get. All of those things together conspire to reduce the credibility of the published literature. We don't know how much we can trust it because we don't actually know all of the process that went into producing it, and puts barriers in self-correction, right? This is the prize of science, is of course we get things wrong all the time. We're studying hard stuff, but we self-correct. Science sorts out which of the findings we have are credible and which are not. But if we don't have transparency, we don't have an opportunity to self-correct on the original findings. And if we don't do things like replication, it's hard to actually engage the self-corrective process. And so together, those things lead to more waste, slower progress, and less return on our research investments. And all of that leads to this sense that the culture that we are in is not rewarding the values that we have for how we think and why we got into science in the first place. So our goal, and the goal of all of our different partners, the ambassador program Pedro mentioned, is to try to see what can we do to shift this research culture. So I just want to give a couple of examples of interventions and the approach we have for trying to change that research culture. And the solutions that I focus on will just be these three: sharing data, sharing materials so that people can evaluate the basis of the claims that I make and reuse that material for replications or for other investigations, and pre-registration of me saying in advance, this is a study that I'm going to do so that you can discover all the studies that I did, even if I didn't publish all of them, and to commit to what were my plans beforehand versus what was discovered after the fact, so that you can calibrate your confidence of, were these actual predictions and strong statistical inferences from those predictions, or were these discoveries that were made interactively with the data that may be true but have somewhat less confidence because they were dependent on decisions that I made as I looked at the data. So these are three of the key things that we have been promoting as behaviors that would help to shift the system towards greater credibility over time. And our approach to changing the research culture is to appreciate that this is a systems challenge. That again, it's not in any individual researcher saying, I want to be closed and I want to do it this way. It's all of us being part of a system that has a certain reward structure. And so the way to make that change is to provide infrastructure to make new behaviors possible. That at least opens the door for those innovators to start saying, I don't care what the incentive system is. I just want to try out these new behaviors because I care about them. If we can make that infrastructure easy to use, integrate into other researchers' workflows so that pre-registration actually helps, for example, their planning process, then we can engage those early adopter communities that see the value of the behavior and are willing to try it, even if they're not themselves, if the incentives aren't there to reward them for it. They just want to do it because they see the value for it. Then we can work on the norms in the communities. Science is decentralized, and so there's no one in charge of how to behave. So we learn about what the behaviors are appropriate from observing others that do research in our areas. So if we can engage communities to work on popularizing, making visible open behaviors, then that may engage more of the community to adopt those behaviors through social norms. Then if we can engage incentives, actually change that model from positive, novel, tidy results to rigorous research, transparent research being rewarded, then that really can get the entire community shifting towards new behaviors. And then, of course, there are always some that will not change their behavior no matter what, because they've been doing it this way for a long time. And so policies are needed to make those new behaviors required so that they will start to engage on those new behaviors. Okay, so that's the very brief version of our change model. And so I want to give a couple of examples of each of these levels of services that we are working on to try to change the system. So at the base, infrastructure is the Open Science Framework, or OSF.io. This is a free service that we maintain. It's open source infrastructure to help researchers with all of these behaviors, planning their research, making things available, pre-registration, data sharing, etc. So if you're not a user yet, you are welcome to go make use of that if any of these behaviors are of interest to you, and this would be a useful service. I'm not going to say any more about infrastructure. I'm going to instead focus on the norms, incentives, and policies. So the first example of an intervention at norms is about signaling. We know, and through lots of areas of research, the value of signaling, right? Of making a behavior visible or a belief visible so that it influences others in your community. Badges are an opportunity to increase visibility of open behaviors. And so the idea of badges for open practices is that if a journal wants to create new norms in their community for openness, they can offer badges to researchers that are willing to share their data, share their materials, or if they had pre-registered their research beforehand. And so if the journal offers these badges on articles when the researchers qualify for them, then they may send signals to other readers of that journal that there are researchers in their community that do these behaviors, and that those behaviors are possible, and that the behaviors may actually even be easy to do. And just knowing that, because they're valued behaviors, may make it more likely for others in the community to adopt those behaviors. So this is a silly intervention in one way, badges, like we're adults, we don't need badges. But in another sense, they're an obvious intervention for social change, for making visible a behavior that everyone values, but no one sees others doing. And so that visibility may help stimulate change. So our first test of badges was adoption by the journal Psychological Science. Psych Science adopted badges on January 1st, 2014. And what I'm showing you here is the percent of articles on the y-axis reporting that data was available in Psych Science in black and 4 comparison journals in gray in the 6-month intervals prior to adopting badges. Then badges were adopted, as I said, January 1st, 2014. And the change looks like this. There's no change over the next 18 months in the comparison journals rates of sharing data. But after 18 months, 39% of the articles in Psych Science had open data. And in fact, if you look over the last year, it's more than 80% of articles in Psych Science have open data. And that's essentially as high as it can get in that journal, because there are some kinds of data in psychology that are not able to be shared openly. They can't be anonymized or are proprietary or other reasons for not being able to share. So this kind of intervention can be sufficient to stimulate culture change because we think of the visibility that it engenders. Okay, that's example 1 at the norms level of intervention. Example 2 at the incentives level is the model of registered reports. In case this isn't familiar to you, here is the very brief version of what registered reports are. So this is a cartoon of the research process, right? We design a study, we collect and analyze the data, we write a report, and then we publish it. But of course, that's not the whole story. There is this big barrier of peer review after writing the report and before the publication. But in this standard model, all of the incentives are make that report as publishable as possible so that it gets through peer review for publication. And it depends on the results. Registered reports makes one key change to the process, and that is to move the first stage of peer review to after the design phase. So as an author, what I do if I want to submit a registered report to a journal is I might conduct some preliminary exploratory research and write that up. And then I'd write my motivating question and my background for why that motivating question is important. And then I spell out the methodology of my follow-up study or studies that are really going to test that question. And then I submit that to the journal for review. And the editor and the reviewers read the submission and ask, is that an important question? And is the methodology an effective test of that question? And if they agree with those two things, then at this stage, they commit the journal to publishing the results, regardless of what the outcomes are. And it's regardless of what the outcomes are, because there are no outcomes yet. The studies have not been conducted yet. And so what the journal is doing is fundamentally changing the incentives for me as an author. Instead of being rewarded for beautiful results, I'm not at all rewarded for those because we don't know what the results will be. I get rewarded, I get the publication, for asking important questions and designing rigorous methodologies to test those questions. So this model has been adopted by more than 300 journals over the last 7 years that we've been promoting registered reports. And we now have some accumulated experience with the initial registered reports that have been conducted and published about whether it is addressing some of the dysfunction in the system. So here's one example showing that it addresses that problem of selective reporting that I mentioned at the beginning. Anne Scheel and her colleagues looked at published registered reports and then comparison articles that in similar journals published at similar times. In those standard articles in the same kinds of journals, almost all of the initial finding in the paper were positive results. They found evidence consistent with the reported hypothesis, more than 90%. In registered reports, where it was published before knowing what the results would be, only just over 40% of the articles found evidence favoring the original hypothesis. This itself shows how registered reports, if not entirely eliminates, mostly eliminates a key source of bias, of selective reporting. Of course, we get things wrong all the time. We just don't put them in our papers because we're not rewarded. But registered reports removes that and rewards people for running good methodologically sound studies to test important questions. The second thing that's of interest to many is whether then publishing all of these negative results leads to registered reports being ignored, because that's one of the arguments against publishing null or negative results, is that people don't care about them, they don't have impact, and so no one will cite them, and so why bother? Well, this analysis suggests that that intuition is wrong. Of an initial sample of registered reports, compared to similar articles published in the same journal around the same time, 100 would indicate that the citation rate in 3 different databases, Google Scholar, Scopus, and Web of Science, is equivalent between the registered reports and the standard reports. Above the line indicates that registered reports are cited more than similar standard reports, and below the line would have indicated standard reports being cited more than registered reports. So if anything, we would conclude here that there's no difference, or even that at least among initial registered reports, they get a slightly more attention. We can only speculate the reasons why, and this is only one sample, but one potential reason is that if the editor, the reviewers, and the authors all have to agree in advance that this is an important question to answer, then any answer is of value. And also, if the editor and reviewers get to provide feedback on the design of the research, the methodology before it's conducted to really maximize its quality, then the registered reports may be recognized as being of higher quality and therefore ultimately have higher impact, because people would say, wow, we learned a lot more from this, even though it violated what we thought might occur. So we also pursued evidence of that, which is, are registered reports peer-reviewed, reviewed by peers as being higher quality than standard reports? And so we took 29 registered reports and identified that these are all published now, final registered reports that are in print. And then we took comparison articles published from the same journal around the same time, or by the same lead authors published around the same time. And then we had peer reviewers read and evaluate two articles, one registered report and one of these comparison articles, and evaluate them on 19 different criteria for quality and rigor and other things. And I don't want to spend a lot of time so that we have some time for discussion, but here is an overview of the results. What you see in the top part are the evaluations of registered reports versus standard reports when they read the article up through the methodology, but didn't know the results yet. And so they rated to the right of the dotted line registered reports as higher quality than standard reports on the rigor of the methodology, on the quality of the methods, on the amount that we will learn, the quality of the research question, etc. These are Bayesian credible intervals for information. And you can see that none of them have the estimate, the big dot, being in the direction of standard reports outperforming registered reports. But there are certainly areas where registered reports did particularly well, and other areas where registered reports did slightly better, but perhaps not meaningfully better than registered reports, such as the creativity of the methods or the novelty of the question. Then we had the reviewers read the results section and the discussion of what the researchers actually found between the registered report and the standard report, and then again rated each of them. And what you see here is that, again, registered reports were evaluated more favorably on the rigor of the analysis, on the whether the conclusions were justified for what they learned from it, the quality of the results, the quality of the discussion, and even the amount that was learned, despite the fact that many of these produce null findings. And you can see, again, directionally favoring registered reports, but weaker on things like whether the results were innovative and whether they were important findings. And then we had them read the title and the abstract and give overall ratings for the paper. And you can see the story is the same. On every single criteria, registered reports performed better than standard reports, from a lot to slightly. So for us, this is initial evidence that really reinforces the value, potential value of registered reports as a complement to the standard model of reporting research. I don't think it should be the only model of how research gets conducted, because there's a lot in exploration and discovery that may not be captured through a registered reports model. But that's something we can talk about more in the discussion if there are questions about that. But this model also provides an opportunity to get multiple stakeholders involved in a singular process. So authors could submit their registered report proposal and simultaneously have journals review it, just as I described, and funders be prepared to fund it if it makes it through the review process. Authors love this concept because I submit once and I get the publication and the money. Journals love this concept because they get high quality submissions coming to their journals because there's the promise of funding. And funders love this because funders experience lots and lots of waste of research that they fund that never gets published at all because of the processes we've already discussed. So all of these groups could align on a singular process that helps each of them and simultaneously helps to improve the quality and conduct of the research process itself. So we have a project funded by NSF, the National Science Foundation in the United States, to evaluate the effectiveness of these funder journal partnerships on shifting the research culture and improving it towards greater transparency and rigor. So we have a number of partners, as you see in the image of the funders, that are engaging on interventions like this within different research communities. So we'll learn a lot, I think, from this process. So let me close with enough time to have some questions and answers by giving returning to this graphic of the dysfunctional research culture and highlighting how just these three behaviors, open data and open materials, and pre-registration and its cousin or sibling or I don't know, child. I don't know what the relationship between pre-registration and registered reports. Registered reports has pre-registration in it, but it is a broader concept than just pre-registration, which you can do separate from a journal. But just these three behaviors address some of the key challenges for the dysfunctional culture. And then the addition of registered reports directly addresses those incentives for reward. And so as a consequence, as these behaviors become more common, you can expect that you can see the graying out here, that that some of the influences, the negative influences in discussion, in the dysfunction, start to fade. And the more that we can get those to fade, the closer that we can align those values that I opened with what the practices are in everyday research. So, oh, there they are again. So those are responsible for that. Okay, so let me close just by saying this isn't all in theory. There is evidence that the research culture is starting to change. Of course, change is happening faster in some places than others and on some behaviors compared to others. But there's a lot happening over the last 10 years suggesting that the research community, both as a grassroots effort and as those stakeholders changing their expectations, are shifting the research culture towards more openness and reproducibility. And I'll just give a couple of examples that are easily available to us at COS because we track them to understand how researchers are using the services that we provide for free. So for example, this is a graph showing the growth in the number of registered users of the OSF, the infrastructure we have from when it was released in 2012 through the end of last year, 2020. And it was closing in here on 300,000. It's now well over 300,000. It's up here off the screen at this point. We expect it to get to about close to 400,000 by the end of this year. So you can see that it's nonlinear growth just in using this one service. And there are many options like the OSF that one can use. Likewise, the number of pre-registered studies is increasing with nonlinear rates. Just on the OSF, you can see here the number of registered studies through 2020 also shows that dramatic growth. And then finally, it's not just researchers adding things themselves and nobody looking at it. There is a lot of use of material that's shared on OSF. So you can see on the graph here the number of unique visitors coming to OSF to get content, to read, to reuse, to adapt for their own research purposes. And just to put some numbers on the amount of sharing in context, in 2020 alone, more than 3.27 million files were added to just the OSF. 2 million of those made publicly accessible. A lot of research can't be made publicly accessible, or researchers want to wait, right? They're using the OSF for managing their private research, and then they make it public later when they're ready to. And that work was downloaded just in that year 36 million times or more. So change is happening, and I'm sure that other services like OSF could show you similar graphs and dramatic growth rates. But to really solve this, we have to embrace it as a systems challenge. That researcher is influenced by the publishers of the journals that she publishes in, the university or institution that she's a member of, the funders that fund her work, and the societies that set the norms and interactions of what's good and valued of the work in that field. If we don't address the norms and incentives and policies across all of these units in concert, we won't create sustainable change in the system that is aligned with the values that we have for how the system should operate. And so there's a lot of work to do, but we are very grateful for all of the work that communities are doing themselves and in collaboration with each other to really continue to advance the cause and the impact of open science for making the research culture the way that we all wish and hope it can be. So thank you very much for your time and attention. Here are some links to some of the things that I mentioned during the presentation, including these slides. You can obtain them at the link at the bottom. And then there's also some page of references in case you want to look up any of the papers of research that I mentioned. So thanks again. I'll be happy to have any questions if there's time for them.
Thank you very much, Professor Nosek, for the inspiring talk on the necessity of a cultural change on how science is made. During your presentation, the audience participated in the chat by posting questions and comments, so we can try to cover them as many as possible. Okay. Natalia Pinheiro asks, Professor Nosek, what do you think are the challenges open science may face in developing countries such as Brazil?
That's a great question because a lot of the conversation about open science, particularly in the prominent journals that have been covering it, focus on open science from a highly resourced institutional perspective, right? A research university that has hundreds of $millions of grants and has tons of postdoc, just an environment that is a very special and exclusive environment, rather than the breadth of environments where research is being conducted in reality, across national context, across developing versus developed world context, and across contexts like research institutions versus more teaching-focused institutions. So there is a rich counter conversation to that of saying that we have to think about open science as inclusive science, that really we can say that openness is about transparency, which it is, but openness is also about inclusion and recognition that progress in science depends on improving the degree to which it is actually horizontal. Instead of the current systems that tend to aggregate resources to a very small number of people in a very small number of places to do huge amounts of investment, a more equitable distribution of resources gives more people the opportunity to contribute and gives the research system an opportunity to maximize its capacity. Because what is the difference of $100,000 US for someone that already has $10 million laboratory versus someone that has $100 US available to them? It's a massive difference in what they can do with it. So that's one part of the challenge for openness, is how resources get distributed. A second part of that question is that we have more opportunity to diversify what it means to be a contributor to scholarly research. And this has implications across all of these dimensions. And it is a more inclusive model instead of the vertically integrated model, where to be a contributor to science, I have to come up with the question, I have to design the research, I have to acquire the resources, I have to collect the data, I have to analyze the data, I have to write the report. In the standard model, all of that occurs in a singular environment, right? Me individually, or my research group, or my slightly broader collaborative network. In a horizontal model, we embrace that lots of people have lots of different skills, lots of different capacity, and different areas of interest that excite them and where they want to get involved in the research process. So I might be someone that loves analyzing data, but hates writing reports. Why shouldn't I be able to be a contributor on data analysis across a variety of different projects and leave the report writing to others. I might be someone that has access to an interesting sample, but I don't have the time because of my teaching responsibilities to generate the research designs. I'd love to collaborate with someone at another institution that has lots of interest in design, but doesn't have access to the samples that they would need to conduct it. So the more that we can distribute and then reward people for independent kinds of contributions to scholarly research, the better that we will be able to raise capacity across all kinds of different contexts, developing world and otherwise. So I hope that's at least partial response to that question. It's a critical one, and there's many more dimensions to pull out from that. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Daniele Santos Vicentiner asks, Professor Nosek, how does open science take a stand in relation to the expression publish or perish?
Great question. So the pressures of publication are real in the sense that they have, in many environments, been a gatekeeper for whether I get to have a career. And so that publish or perish mindset is strongly connected to that idea that I opened with, that publication depends on, the incentives for publication depend on getting positive results, novel results, tidy results. So those are strongly linked because the pressure is intense. I have to get those results if I want to have a career. And if I'm studying an area that is difficult and challenging, which most of us are studying things that are difficult and challenging, I may do the most rigorous work, I may do the best work, and I may still not get positive, novel, tidy results. And so I will perish. So the cause for open science, both on rigor and on reinforcing the values that we have for wanting to be transparent and open and pursue the most important questions, really require us to change what it means to get published, at least. So the registered reports model doesn't remove publication as an incentive, right? You could still perish if you never write a registered report. But what it does is at least it aligns the values that we have with what it takes to get that publication, instead of the things that we can't control, right? The results. And so that is at least one step towards addressing some of the dysfunctional pressures on publication. Whether we should change the expectations for publication at all is another interesting concept and debate that is occurring in the open science movement. But of course, if we pursue that direction, then we have to have some alternative. How is it that we can decide how to evaluate researchers? And there are less jobs than there are people that want jobs. What are the selection processes to decide who gets the jobs at the next level? So thank you for that excellent question.
And I do feel that pressure as an undergraduate student that wants to pursue a career. So it's important to think about these new possibilities for us.
Yeah.
Pietra Casal-Rigatti asks, Professor, what are your thoughts on how to convince politicians and investors who think that changes towards open science may make science more time-consuming and less efficient financially?
It's a great question because it is right now embracing a theory that open science will make things actually faster and actually better returns on research investment. So it is reasonable that a funder or a politician or otherwise would be skeptical. The system operates this way. It must operate this way for a reason, right? It can't be operating in a crazy way. Why would scientists design it that way? And of course, those of us in the field know, well, we didn't really design it. It just sort of emerged. And yeah, it is kind of crazy, but that's what it is. But there is an accumulating base of evidence that a lot of these practices can improve the return on research investments. And that is getting the attention of politicians and policymakers and funders. They see, for example, the evidence I just showed you about registered reports eliminating publication bias and improving the rigor and quality of the research. There are a number of funders who say that is very interesting because they know that they have research waste in what they fund. And so a number of them are willing now to try tests. Well, we're not ready to change our entire funding model, but we will resource registered reports for this particular domain. So for example, we just got an award. We haven't announced it yet, but we got an award from the Templeton World Charity Foundation to sponsor grants in consciousness research. So if you study consciousness in any way, these are grants for registered reports of consciousness research studies. And they gave about $1 million to fund grants for different researchers in that community to do registered reports to see if they could stimulate more activity there. So change is happening, but it requires us as a community to study and evaluate these interventions, to provide evidence, to make the real case that the compelling theoretical argument, see how this would work, actually works out in practice. And if it doesn't work out in practice, we need to know that too, right? We need to know that the interventions that seem like such a great idea actually didn't work or had these terrible consequences we didn't realize would happen, so that we can change course, right? The culture change is not about let's have registered reports because we like registered reports. It's let's make sure that we are doing science the best way we can. And if registered reports doesn't help that, get rid of that and try something else. So thank you for that question.
Professor, may we have one more question? And
yes.
Okay. Professor Mayusi Mota says first, Professor Nosek, thank you for this inspiring talk. And she also asks, in your view, what's the role of journal editors and publishers in stimulating changes in research culture, change towards open science?
Yeah, publishers and editors play a very important role, and they can, because they're at the front lines of these key incentives, right? To the extent that editors and publishers don't change, the rest of the system cannot change because they serve as the gatekeepers right now. So what we really need is for them to help to facilitate adoption of these open practices. So there are three things that we promote most specifically. One is adoption of the top guidelines. This is transparency and openness promotion guidelines. This is a policy framework for journals' expectations of their authors in sharing data or materials or doing replication studies or otherwise. So that's one. Second is adopting badges so that can start to signal to the community that this journal cares about these open practices and to make visible those researchers that are adopting those behaviors. And then the third is trying out registered reports and seeing if this model can work in the context of the research that they conduct. There are additional things beyond those three that we could talk about as in the breadth of open science, right? Opening up peer review more, and I know Oberlin is doing a fair bit on promoting greater openness in review process, and making the journal operations more transparent, and supporting preprints as a mechanism for ensuring the dissemination and accelerating the dissemination of research. So there are many clusters of activities, but those are the central ones that for us are at the heart of a lot of this work.
So I would like to thank you very much for your answers and for your brilliant talk. Also, I'd like to thank the interpreters for being with us today and help us with the accessibility of our event. And now I would like to know if you want, Professor Nosek, say some final words for our audience. And the ones who could not have the questions answered, you may contact Professor Nosek in another opportunity or by email.
Yes, absolutely. Drop me an email or reach out to the organization. We're happy to provide help on any of these. We exist to support this culture change. So let us know how we can help you.
So, thank you very much.
Thank you. Be well, everybody.